if you looked at my history, you wouldn't find, like, I wasn't that person that grew up not wanting to have children. I was a person that grew up wanting to have children, that wanted to get pregnant and had like a list of all the names that I was going to name my children. And I don't know what happened in the years that I transitioned, but for whatever reason, I ended up pursuing the hysterectomy. So, in the first 6 months after detransition, that was what I was processing, was the fact that I'm now infertile. I still have ovaries. So like in in a world where I have thousands and thousands of dollars and then nothing unethical would happen, I could still have a child, but it's probably not going to happen. But in the first 6 months post detransition, every time I saw a child interacting with a parent, I started crying. I had days where I just sort of went and lay on my bed and cried for a long time. I called up my doctor and I told her, I want to see a fertility clinic. And that was the first time I told her I detransitioned, basically, was basically telling her that I want to get pregnant now. And, I had a surgery that makes me not be able to be pregnant ever. And, I don't know. She didn't even take that as like, she didn't, I don't know. I don't think my doctors are ever going to sound sorry, but she didn't seem to feel bad about it or in any way. It was just sort of, oh, okay. You would have gotten pregnant if you didn't have a hysterectomy. Okay. And I don't know. They made it very neutral. But yeah, so the 6 months after that were really difficult. And like, I don't know, Christmas last year, my parents were like taking pictures of like my nieces and nephews, and I had to leave the room because I was crying, because I was like, there's a part of me being like, I'll never give my nieces and nephews any cousins, or my parents will never see me have children, or anyway. So
Hello.
I
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Good.
What's your native time zone?
EST.
Oh, cool. Did you have a fruitful morning?
um I would say that I probably slept through most of it. I woke up probably around 11:45.
Did you have a late night?
So
Or did you just get
I
some time
did
to
have
relax?
a weirdly late night. For weeks, I had like a good sleep schedule going, and then in the past week, I've been awake until 4 in the morning. Um, Probably just because I don't have any work right now, but I should have work tomorrow. So
Are you just what's it called? Are you just watching all the Battlestar Galactica episodes back to back?
Arrested Development,
Oh
actually.
yeah?
Yeah.
Is this your first time through it?
I've watched like the first 5 episodes like a bunch of times because my brother was really into Arrested Development, and then it something never clicked, and now this time through, I'm enjoying it more. So
Yeah.
who knows?
That's a brilliant series. A lot of just clever wordplay that you don't pick up
Mhm.
till the second time or till you clue into what they're playing around with.
Yeah,
Do
but no,
you
I've
have
been yeah.
are you a writer yourself or a comedic kind of person?
I like to think that I'm a writer. Um, like since I was a child, I had hyperlexia, so I was reading before kindergarten, basically. So like at like age 4, I was reading already, and had like a really, so I'm told, big vocabulary. I would say I still have a big vocabulary. I just don't use it all. So like I know all the words, but like when I'm speaking, they're not all coming out, so I don't sound smart, I don't think. But yeah, so when I was learning to read as a child, there was another part of that I loved, was just like writing little books. So I just staple paper together and write little books. Um, and now I'm trying to work on my book. So about just sort of like my transition and detransition and sort of all of my feelings about that. So I like to think I'm a writer. Maybe one day something will actually come of that. It'll actually be something published. So I guess we'll find out.
You just gotta hammer and hammer and hammer and hammer.
Yeah, and it's hard because like for probably for a week I was doing really good. Probably got 10,000 words in one week, and then the week after I was just didn't want to do anything. Um, I mean, I guess part of it is probably because it's a hard subject to go over, so you
Well,
get burnt out.
yeah, you get
Yeah,
burnt out, and it's probably very difficult to be aware to what extent you're actually processing things while you're putting them on the page. And so periods of exhaustion or disinterest are probably just your subconscious machinery saying, hold on, we gotta reconfigure all these feelings, you know?
yeah, and especially like one of the parts that I've already gotten through is like early childhood bullying, and I didn't even go into it into like extreme detail, but just the remembering of what sort of went through my head and like what these kids sort of instilled in me, I guess, over the years, like the what a CBT therapist would call core beliefs, basically. So like this idea that all these kids think I'm ugly, all these kids think that I'm gross and disgusting, and that I don't know, I'm just easy to make cry, um, stuff like that. Just and just the idea that I'm unlikable. So those are sort of the main core beliefs: or you're ugly, you're really gross and disgusting, and also nobody likes you, and that's just going to be your lot in life. Basically, is every person that you meet is eventually going to hate you. So going through that, and then thinking about where I am in my time of life right now, where I'm trying to like find a partner and settle down, and I'm still single, and I've been single for several years, 4 years now, 4 or 5 years, and putting those two things together just suddenly made me really, really depressed. Just the idea of not being attractive to people, and people just not going to like me, and I'm probably going to be alone forever. Those sort
Mm-hmm.
of feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that sort of what's the word? It's put like a blockade up on me trying to finish the book. So
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to shoulder, and also to remember to be kind to yourself. You know, kind of like be the adult and let yourself be a child again. You know, kind of do both, swap between those things.
yeah, there's there's a lot of the adult parts of me talking to child parts of me, being like, oh, you might think you're ugly, but also you don't really value conventional beauty, so why do you care anyway? Like that sort of thing. Or also, you know, I guess a lot of it is me just being worried about being unlikable, and then I guess comparing that to, every time I've been out in the world, there aren't really that many people who don't like me. So really it's sort of just trying to find like those rational parts of you, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that you get in as an adult.
Perspective.
Yeah.
When you were a kid, how did you end up coping to become likable in school? Did you become the class clown? Did you get involved in cliques? Did you isolate yourself and just show
It
yourself?
was isolating. Yeah.
Okay.
So instead of trying, no, it was all learned helplessness. So basically, over the years, I realized that nothing that I was doing was really changing their minds. So I just sort of um, just became sort of like a shell of myself, I guess. So like I had like one friend through some of those years in my school. I switched schools in like grade three. So I had friends up to that point, and then when I switched, I was in the same school as people that bullied me in my neighborhood. So it sort of set the tone, I guess. And I did make a friend later on in school, but even that friend ended up being a bully later on.
Hmm.
So like by the time I was preteen, so age 12, 13, I just didn't have any friends. And my whole process was basically just like, let's get through elementary school. And as soon as I'm in high school, I'll be around hundreds of people instead of the same 30 kids I've been with for the last 5, 6 years. So,
So were you in a
yeah.
rural, provincial town when you were in elementary school?
Yeah, it was rural enough.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't urban by any means, but like it's not so much that there were farms in the town, but it wasn't like a farming town. But like it was a population of 3,000, so it was pretty small.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
then high school was like kind of a regional high school. You all went to.
yeah. So I also went to Catholic schools my
Okay.
entire school.
Oh,
So
the whole time.
not in like post secondary, but all the way from like kindergarten to grade 12 was all Catholic school.
Okay.
So the only Catholic high school was a couple cities, a couple towns away. So
How
that's where I
far
went.
did you have to travel?
45 minutes.
Oh, I guess that's not too bad.
It wasn't terrible, except for the fact that like most of the bullying that happened to me happened on the bus.
Oh man.
So even switching to when I went to high school, it was like, okay, I got away from all these kids that make fun of me, but also I have to deal with them 45 minutes a day, twice a day. So an hour and a half every day. But most of them kind of grew up by that time, and me not paying attention to them, I think, sort of made it not so fun for them to bully me anymore. So it wasn't as bad, but still, it
Mhm.
was it was tough, a tough period of time.
How did Catholicism inform you? Did it have
Like
much of an
my life,
influence? Yeah.
um,
Was
I
it kind of
don't.
just there, just a structure? Did it something that you rebelled against, or something that you found relief through, or
It was
flourishing?
probably something I rebelled against for sure. So like I was that kid in grade 8 that we had. They must have been like youth group people. So it was like older teenagers that were like cool Christians that came to the school to like talk. And I was the one there being like, if miracles exist, why don't they exist today? Like that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So that kind of weird person that was just sort of like, I'm not sure I agree with you, but and then everyone else was just sort of like, but I don't know. I think around that age is when I was on the internet really young for a millennial. So I'm 34, but I was really, really obsessed with the internet by the time I was 10. So like mid 90s, 1998. Um, and
So, what was the internet back then? Were you on Usenet or
oh,
forums or what?
so I was on IRC, Internet Relay Chat. I was on MSN Messenger. I was on AOL Instant Messenger, ICQ. So I had all of those.
So, could you just
Yeah.
describe that? I can't really remember what those are like. So, it sounds like a kind of some sort of Twitter, or is it a forum or chat rooms, or how does the network work back then?
So they're all different. IRC is more like a chat room. It's just sort of all text chat. Um, that was more for like, I would say like 90% of the people on it were like all nerdy guys. Um,
And was it divided into subjects, topics?
yeah, so they all had different servers. It's almost like Discord, actually.
Okay.
So they all had different servers, and you kind of just had to know where the channels were. There was like a way to like search for channels and choose one. But back then I was mostly just role playing. So I was like pretending to be a wolf or pretending to be a horse usually. That was my thing when I was 10 years old, was just like, it was like writing stories with other people, right? So
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And
just
was
your
there?
main character.
Is it like within like some sort of like people who are pretending that you're on a farm? Was there like a like kind of a domain, or just everybody just started playing these characters? Was there a world that you guys
Yeah.
created together?
So on IRC, it was more like sort of open, I think. And then there were also message boards that were basically, you post a message and then wait for someone to like use their character and post to like a paragraph in response, sort of thing. And those that were on websites had more of like a structure to it, where it was, there you're playing a wolf in a wolf pack. And then there's the alpha female and the alpha male, and then the beta female and the beta male that are just right below them. And there's all the sort of hierarchy and structure. And, you go to this different message board when you want to mate and have babies.
Wow. Okay.
But it wasn't very detailed. But like, yeah, it was just sort of these games that people made so that you could have a structure of writing stories, which I guess is kind of like D&D, but like in written form,
Mm-hmm.
but also for animals. And this was like teenage girls, mostly, almost entirely teenage girls, I think. But that was
So,
my thing in like when I was 10 to 12.
okay. Did you, thinking back on that, was there any sort of adult supervision or the lack of that leading to grooming kind of stuff? Were you aware of that?
Yeah. I didn't have a lot of supervision online. Um, Although my parents were cautious for sure, but I was that sort of person that I developed a really strong addiction really early. So I would be online, just sort of chatting or role playing or whatever until I had bedtime. And then I would go to bed. And then after my parents would fall asleep, I would get up and go back on the computer. We only had the one computer. So in the living room, basically,
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of everywhere. And then I would be on again until, 2 in the morning and then go to sleep. But so during those times, there were no um, people supervising. That the one friend that I mentioned before, she was sort of the one that got me into areas of the internet that I wouldn't have gone to otherwise. So just like chatting with older boys who said they were older boys, might have been men, who knows. So I think that's where you're sort of going with the grooming and the potential for just like other people on there. And so those were people that were, I guess, trying to have cyber sex with me, as in I was always telling the truth about my age. So like looking back on it, it's very, very uncomfortable to think of the fact that even if they weren't lying, there would be like 16-year-old boys hitting on 11-year-old girls. It's a little weird. So, no, that happened as well. But I think there was a part of me that just wasn't, I was just not into it the way that like my friend was. So, like, for example, I had like one chat with this guy that was clearly interested in me. And then as the chat sort of went on further and further, there was a part of me going, I don't like this. And I'm going to pretend that my internet has disconnected now. It basically
Mm-hmm.
just left. So, yeah,
And where'd you go on from that past year when you started becoming a teenager?
live journal.
Live journal. So is this
Yeah.
more diary based stuff rather than pretending to be an animal? You're
Yes. Sorry. Just the pretending to be an animal just was. I know that's what it is, but like just hearing someone say it like that is funny. But yeah, no, it was more diary stuff by that age. So in high school, age 13, 14, then I was probably on live journal by that time. Um, and there were less role playing and more like just talking to people. And like my first boyfriend I met online, um, on one of these chat rooms, and he was 4 years older than me. So he had just turned 18 when we met, and I was 14. And so that's sort of where it went. Me and that boyfriend met a couple times in person, with my parents sort of behind every single corner, making sure nothing was happening.
hmm.
And things did happen anyway, but you know, so that's sort of where it went, I guess. It's sort of diary and
Is it
Yeah.
Thinking back on that, are you inventing yourself, exploring yourself? What kind of parameters of your personality are starting to become awake and alive through this live journal process?
Mm.
Questioning emotions? Are you actually like talking about your real feelings, or are you kind of inventing a new persona? Or
It's a little bit of both. Um, because I look back on it and even for example, like the boyfriend that I just mentioned in that live journal, I would say things about how, I enjoyed being intimate with him or whatever, and that, I couldn't wait to do it again or whatever but that actually wasn't true. Like I didn't enjoy it for whatever reason, but I didn't like it, but I pretended to like it. So there was some pretending for sure, trying to seem like I was older than I was, or um, understood more than I understood, that sort of thing. But there was also a lot of, um, when I think about those live journal entries, there are some of them that are just really embarrassing because, I was a 15-year-old girl that was incredibly angry. And
hmm.
um, yeah, so it's really just like, I think it was a little bit of both. Some of it was pretending and sort of creating a persona, and then another part of it was just sort of venting, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What happened to all that writing? Did it just disappear one day? AOL came along and shut it down? Wonder where all these archives are. Not just of you
um
specifically, but like it just seems like there's a huge mass of human data just sitting somewhere gone.
I mean, LiveJournal's still running. I have all my LiveJournal entries. Like I really obsessively archive everything I've ever written, so I have all of that. um Yeah. What I would like is like all the pictures that I used to have online. I can't find any of those anymore. The writing was a lot easier to find.
Hmm.
But yeah. No, and I also think of like my Tumblr, even though Tumblr is still running, um, just sort of like that entire thing is, um, what's the word? It's let's say archive again. It's an archive of like my history, I
Mm-hmm.
guess,
Yeah.
of just sort of even the process that I went through. And I have sort of a saved version of it. And if you start going back far enough, then you start finding all of the social justice warrior posts. So it's interesting to look back on, because I don't know, a few months ago I went not too far back, but I found like an argument between me and someone else where now I would look back on and be like, actually they were right the whole time, and I was just mean and
Hmm.
not willing to listen to them. So
So this is interesting. Just like as a test or a case study, not to denigrate your humanity or anything, but it's just interesting that your development as a human being like maps onto a very particular point in history, and then all these different mediums or websites or forums and styles of communication are changing, and you're changing with them. So you're going from, let's say, role playing as animals to then being a teenage girl, like writing a diary, which is kind of something that we would think of as stereotypical female thing to do, but it's exposed to the world, and then you're meeting people through that, and then the Tumblr thing starts happening, and then at some point this social justice thing is presented to you. So you go from expressing yourself. What was it that introduced you to that ideology, or being an activist or having an opinion about the world, going from expressing your opinion to now promoting an ideology? How did that lock onto you?
it's a good question. And I think even some of it was still on LiveJournal, because LiveJournal had all those. You had your own diary, but they also had communities. So it was almost like a communal live journal. So everyone can post entries to the same journal kind of thing. So that was sort of also like the precursor to getting on Tumblr. And there were communities in there where there were a lot of people that were very, very social justice minded. And I feel like that's where it really started. And I think the reason it started is I went from high school to immediately moving in with a boyfriend, not the one I've mentioned, but a different one. And so I left high school, immediately moved in with him. I didn't go to university right away. Um, and I had that relationship, which was emotionally abusive. It was very, very controlling. I think he's just not, he was a very insecure person. Um, and coming out of that relationship, I felt like there was a lot of identity searching at that time after coming out of the relationship.
So you're what, 19 or 20 or so?
Yeah, about 20.
Okay.
Um, and in sort of coming out of that relationship, like one of the first things I looked up was asexuality. So um, as I mentioned, it was the same with this new boyfriend as it was with the other boyfriend, is where I didn't really enjoy having sex, and I didn't know why I didn't enjoy it. So that sort of came to be my answer at that time. I don't know if it's still an answer. I don't know if there's enough known about asexuality to know if it's like an actual orientation or if it's just a side effect of me being autistic and being depressed and etc. Who knows? But at any rate, that's where I ended up going, just sort of looking for that identity because there was a part of me that knew that something was wrong here, but I couldn't really figure out what it was. It didn't really seem like I didn't feel like I was like all the other straight girls that I knew, I guess. And I wouldn't call myself straight now. But anyway, um, that's where I first ended up on that message board. And that's where I heard about gender identity for the first time. So um, I think that sort of got me onto it where I started thinking about it. And then it started showing up everywhere else. It started showing up in LiveJournal, started showing up on Tumblr. This was 2008, 2009, I think. So, um,
And how did,
yeah.
what was attractive, or how did gender identity help you cope or deal or fit yourself into the world? Was it convenient in a way?
Yeah. I guess I thought about sort of my entire life when I first came to the idea of gender identity. I thought about my entire life in like retrospect, to sort of comparing everything I'd been through to this idea that you could be another gender, even if your body was male or female. So you could be something else. And I guess when I looked through it, there was like when I looked through my past, there I just felt like there was all of these I don't want to say symptoms, but I guess traits that I thought would be
Yeah.
associated with the opposite sex. So like outside of all of this internet stuff that I was into like video games, and I wasn't into things that were like considered to be typically feminine. So I wasn't, I don't know. I had friends that were into dance and I took dance classes, but I was very, very bad at it, very ungraceful. So I dropped out of dance classes. Um, and I don't know. Maybe that other part where people thought I was gross because maybe I thought that meant that I was unfeminine or something like that. And I really got along with my brother really well because we had interests in the exact same things all the time. So that made it seem like there was more masculinity in me or something like that. And even in high school, I once joked that like I would like I think what I said was something like I would get a sex change if it didn't cost so much money, blah blah blah. And it's horrible irony now, but at any rate, I would think about things like that and the fact that I came up with like a male alter ego in that same sort of thing where I named this male alter ego of me and um, I don't know, dressed more masculine and like put my hair up in like a backwards baseball cap and was like, look, I'm passing as a boy or something like that. Like there was one instance of when I did that in high school, I guess, in the privacy of my own home. And
How did it
I
make you
took,
feel?
um, That's a good question. Like when I looked in the mirror when I did that, there was sort of it was weird. It was sort of a weird feeling because I was looking at myself and it wasn't me, but it was me. And I think that's really just sort of a feeling that's continued with me throughout transition is just sort of seeing versions of myself that are me, but they're not me. So
Huh.
yeah.
You said it felt weird. It sounds like there's some sort of dissonance there, but is there an elation or something positive there? Do you feel like I can deal with the world better if I'm looked at this way, if I see myself this way, or something like that?
Yeah. So when I did that in high school, I don't think that there was any feeling like that. Like I didn't take it any further than just looking at myself in the mirror. And then when I did it again, I did sort of that same thing of, trying to pass in the mirror as a 21-year-old or whatever. Um, then I liked that more. I don't know. There was a feeling that, I don't know, to be honest, like, this is a question that I can't really answer for some reason because I feel like everyone else is saying that when they passed they felt some kind of gender euphoria to some degree, and I'm sure I did, but for whatever reason I can't access those feelings now
Hmm.
to remember what it felt like at that time. Um, I mean, I know why I ended up doing it, and a lot of it was so. For example, right after I cut my hair, so shortly after I decided I was going to transition, I cut my hair. And I think this was, I remember I was wearing a big coat. But anyway, I was walking home one day in, this was in downtown Toronto, it was sort of uptown Toronto. But I was walking home, it was after midnight. A guy in a taxi pulled over and he was in a business suit and got out and was like, "Hey, do you want to ride home? It's so cold out, blah, blah, blah." And, you know, any other young girl approached at that time of night would be like, no, I will definitely not do that. And for whatever reason, I did get in that car, which was a bad idea. Um, and it was only like, I only lived around the corner. And fortunately, that's what happened is I got driven around the corner. And I guess part of me was like, oh, he's in a taxi cab. This can't go wrong. There's a taxi driver in there. The taxi driver could have been in cahoots with him. I didn't know that. But anyway, um, on that drive home, he asked me a whole host of very uncomfortable questions
Hmm.
about. But first, he asked me if I wanted to go party with him, and I said no. And then he looked very confused. I guess that if you get into a cab with someone, then they think that you're intending to have sex with them. I guess because that's what he said. You don't want to have sex with me, and I was like, no. And then asked me all these questions about whether I was a lesbian, and I said I was asexual because I apparently can't keep my mouth shut. So then he started asking me if I masturbate and et
Hmm.
cetera, et cetera. So like this was right after I was decided that I was going to transition. And right after that happens, this being targeted by someone who could still tell that I was female, even though I had short hair and was wearing a big poofy jacket. And I think it was one of those things that really pushed it forward. This idea that maybe if I pass as a guy, then these guys aren't going to come bother me, sort of thing. So I do think that sort of played into it for sure.
Hmm.
And like, it's probably not a coincidence that I moved out from, I lived with my boyfriend and then I moved in with my parents and then I moved to Toronto and transitioned. That's probably not a coincidence. It's probably, I was in this place with so many people all the time and being perceived all the time. And the idea of being perceived as something else where I would be left alone was very, very enticing.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
There's this kind of meme or trope that's been floating around for several years about the girls who dye their hair bright. There's just some sort of interpretation of it. I don't think it really holds water, but it's just kind of an interesting way of looking at the college girls that dye their hair. In nature, whenever certain animals have bright hair, it's a warning sign that they're dangerous, they're poisonous, right? You're also using that too as like a defense mechanism to camouflage yourself. Like if you become male, you become neutral to the world. You don't get bothered. You're separate from attention that you don't want.
Mm, exactly. Yeah. I think it's interesting too because after I stopped, because I have this weird story where I identified as trans for 10 years, but I stopped taking testosterone about 5 or 6 years in. So I continued on for about 4 or 5 years before detransitioning. Even though I think some people would have said I detransitioned earlier, but I wouldn't have said that. I think that there's a sort of there's a mindset shift that has to go along with it. But what I was going to say is that after I stopped taking testosterone is when I started dyeing my hair fun colors. So it was almost sort of that same thing. And I would have described it as me being like, I'm different, I'm weird, and I'm not ashamed of being weird. And I'm going to show you that I'm weird by having weird colored hair or a weird haircut, or like, I had an asymmetrical haircut for 4 or 5 years, that kind of thing.
So at some point, you didn't mind the attention. It sounds like you had like
Yeah,
self-confidence at some point.
that is sort of what it sounds like, doesn't it? There's a part of it that was like, oh yeah, I don't care about the attention. You can see me, you can see that I'm weird, whatever. And, to not be upset by, people making weird comments about me having parrot colored hair or whatever. um, which is weird at the same time for me to think about because I don't see myself as someone that would invite attention. So that is strange, but yeah.
So you're in your 20s. You decide to transition. How did that decision come about? And then what steps were available to you at the time? What hoops did you have to jump through
Okay.
to access the medical stuff? It sounds like you went through a social transition on your own, or did you have, were you involved in a gender clinic or have any sort of psychological help or psychiatrist stuff?
No. So I did in the year before I decided I was going to transition. So I transitioned in 2010 medically. In 2009, I was seeing a therapist at that time. It wasn't for gender, it was for just general depression and anxiety. Um, and I saw her. And then somewhere at the end of 2009, I stopped sort of questioning gender and was like, before that point, I would have identified as like genderqueer. So like the precursor to non-binary, I guess. Um, and then at some point I was like, yeah, I'm going to go through the medical transition part. And in order to get to that part, I was in a trans support group. So it was specifically for people that were thinking about transitioning and didn't know if they were going to yet. Um, and, until a couple of years ago, I would have said that group was helpful. And now I would have said that group just sort of, it sucked me in. It didn't, what it should have done was give you all of the information, including what might go wrong. It didn't really give you what might go wrong. It was a lot of sort of downplaying. I got the 1% statistic, only 1% of people regret surgery, blah, blah, blah. They don't tell you that the 1% that regrets surgery, they've already filtered out all of the people they think might regret. Like that's what they were doing back then, is they were filtering out everyone who might regret surgery
Wait,
before.
before asking them, they just wouldn't ask the people, or
No, I mean like for people who have gender reassignment surgery, in order to get to that surgery stage, there was all this gatekeeping. So all of the gatekeeping was already doing the work of filtering out all of the people who might have regretted surgery. So, if back then they had what we have now, which is moving towards sort of like this informed consent model, then they would have had a much higher rate of regret because all of those people that they filtered out would have been included and they would have all regretted it.
okay,
So,
just
yeah.
make sure that I have this because this is kind of absurd, like how it's happened. So
Yep.
the 1% statistic is used to upend the gatekeeping because only 1% regret this, so we don't need all this gatekeeping. When the gatekeeping is what it was keeping that, if the stats are correct or accurate, to 1%. So then it completely destroys the model of that 1% because you've used that 1% to revise every other process to that. Okay.
Yeah. So no, it is ridiculous. It's ridiculous in that only 1% regret it. So let's open it up to everyone. But only 1% regretted it because it was closed to people in the first place. So I don't know. It's a very weird way of looking at it, first of all. But even that 1%, I don't think is correct. Just because, and I've had two ideas sort of presented to me into why people might not, why people might be lost to follow up. And one of them is that, especially a decade ago, people would transition and then they would just sort of disappear into, I don't know, their everyday life. They didn't want to be part of like the transsexual community anymore. They just wanted to like live their lives. So that was one option, is that they were lost to follow up because they didn't want anything to do with being trans anymore. They just wanted to live their lives. But obviously the other lost to follow up is people who regretted it and don't want anything to do with it anymore. Mm-hmm. So those are the two options of, that whole, because I mean, that's the thing with those studies, is that even though there's only 1% regret, there's also like 20 to 30% lost to follow up. Okay. So it could be 20 to 30% regretted it. We just don't know. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say.
So when you decided that medical transition was for you, what was presented to you? Oh, one more question actually about the trans support group. What was the makeup, the age range, and the sex makeup of the group? Was it evenly split males, females? Was it young, old?
When I was there, I would say it was mostly evenly split males and females. Okay. Almost everyone there identified sort of as a binary. So either they identified as a trans man or a trans woman. There were a couple people there that identified as like either genderqueer or non-binary. The age range, most of them were young. I would say within 10 to 15 years of me. So 20s, 30s, and there might have been like one or two people that were in their 40s, but I think most of them were younger. But what happened with that is that the two people that ran the group were both transgender themselves, they had transitioned years and years before. And they were both therapists. One of them, one day they said that they had a connection with a clinic that was looking for, they wanted transgender patients for their resident doctors to get what's the word? Experience. They wanted experience with trans healthcare, basically. So they were going to refer one female person, one male person to this clinic. And that's how I got into that clinic, basically. And it wasn't a gender clinic, just to be clear. It was like a regular general practitioner that had connections with this.
Is that called residency? Group. So you were kind of volunteered yourself to be like a part of somebody's residency to get experience as a student, or?
Basically, yeah. So like the doctor was didn't have that experience, got that experience, and then after, she wasn't there for very long, so that clinic and continued to be the place that I went for healthcare until technically I'm still with the doctor that I was last with. I just moved, so I don't have a new doctor yet. But anyway, um, yeah, so she eventually left. And then when she left, then the doctor that was supervising her became my doctor, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I got referred there. And then after 3 appointments, they put me on testosterone.
Does the cocktail include estrogen blockers? I always forget. I should have this memorized by now. I know males need the testosterone blocked and then estrogen. Females just need the testosterone because the magic
Yeah,
testosterone just bulldozes the estrogen, right?
pretty much. Yes. Yeah.
Was that something else? What was it like to be on the man drug?
Um, from what I've heard from everyone else, I almost had like a completely different experience to everyone else. Just like, for example, hearing that, you know, people who go on, women who go on testosterone have like a really, really, um, what's the word? Their libido shoots up basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have that. So like, remember I said before about the whole asexual thing and me thinking, uh, I don't know what causes this. And I think there was a part of me that was hoping that going on testosterone would make me not be asexual. I think there was a part of me that hoped that it would, and if
Unleash
not make
the horn
me,
dog.
yeah, if not make me asexual, make me willing to want to have sex with people.
Mm-hmm.
And that just didn't really happen. I did explore a lot in that first year or so, but it never became something that I was just like actively interested in. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Beyond that, being on the man drug, it made me, it gave me a lot of acne.
Okay.
That was the worst part, was that I had really, really bad acne. It was one of the reasons that I went off early.
Okay.
Because I had dealt with acne through my entire teenage years, and then suddenly to be put on a drug that was now giving me acne again, it wasn't good for my self-esteem.
Yeah.
So
how about emotionally? Did your emotions change? Did your energy levels change?
emotionally, yes. So I was angry instead of sad most of the time. Before I was on testosterone, I would say that I probably cried every single day. And then when I was actually, I mean, I went on antidepressants before I went on testosterone, and that made me stop crying. But the testosterone definitely also, you just can't cry. I don't know why, but I wasn't able to cry when I was on it at all.
How did you process emotions? Did you just
Did I process them?
Did you, yeah, or just not process them? Yeah. Did you have no need to expunge?
That might have been it. I kept writing, so I was still writing like journal entries. I have journal entries from when I was on testosterone and just starting, and even going off. I mean, I have writing all the way back years from now.
Do you recall how your voice changed? Like your writing voice, I mean, changed? Like your interests, your topics, how you framed yourself? Did that kind of go through a transition?
When I transitioned?
Yeah, when you're on testosterone, did your way of thinking change and your way of expressing yourself?
I never thought about that. I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it enough.
We'll have to get
really
a grad student to do a textual analysis of your literary transition.
I would be down for that, to be honest.
Stuff's going on there.
I do know that like the way I write changed a lot in the last years that I was transitioning, because in those last years, in 2017, I got diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, and told that I had symptoms of borderline personality disorder, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, stuff like that.
Hmm.
And
Is this all from one source, one diagnosis, one
it was one
doctor?
psychoeducational assessment. They did 6 to 8 hours of testing, all of just the whole thing basically. So it was like a 25-page assessment.
And why did you take it? Just
Uh,
because you were frustrated with something?
yeah, school specifically.
Okay.
So like if you remember, I said I had hyperlexia when I was a child, but and that meant that I was doing actually really well for like the first, I don't know, few years of school, because people would be like, "Oh, you're so smart. You can spell so well. You can
Yeah.
read so well. You can write so well, et cetera, et cetera." So during those years, I was doing really, really well, and then as things got more and more complicated, I feel like I just wasn't keeping up with everyone as well. And also, as we got into those years, I was getting more depressed and I didn't want to do homework and I didn't want to focus and all of those things. So that was something that happened throughout my life. But in university, I was having such a hard time um, with certain classes. And, there were some classes that I was doing really well. I got an A plus in like a semantics class that was like third year, and it was a tough class. And I was shocked that I got an A plus. And then there were other classes that I was failing, and I couldn't figure out why. I was just confused as to why I'm supposed to be. I was told my whole life that I'm smart. If you're so smart, then what the heck's going on? So
Mm-hmm.
what that did was I ended up going for the psychoeducational assessment to be like, okay, someone told me that I sounded like their friends that have ADHD, which I didn't take as an insult. I took that as oh, maybe I have ADHD. So that's why I went. And when I was there, they also told me I had was met all the diagnostic criteria for autism. And the years after that became very much sort of processing those disabilities and realizing that I grew up with those disabilities, and the reason that I wasn't fitting in was because I was autistic. It's because I was missing all these social skills. Um, because, there were all of these things that I could be doing to fit in, but I didn't know I should be doing it to fit
Mm-hmm.
in, because there was a part of me that was very, I should get to be myself and people should accept me for who I am. But as it turns out, kids don't really think that way. That's more of I do think more adults think that way. They think, oh, you can be who you're yourself, and we're not going to make fun of you. It's more of an adult sort of thing. Not everyone's like that, but um, at any rate, all of that processing happened. I started doing autism activism.
Oh.
So shortly after I was diagnosed, a couple of years after, I started getting involved in like the autistic community.
Okay. Okay.
And those were the years that I think my writing changed the most, because I was starting to recognize um, abusive behavior in group dynamics, especially in activism. And part of that was I took a critical thinking class, which I should have
Uh-oh.
done much, much sooner.
Or not at
So,
all. Like either.
well, it was okay, because it was just teaching you like the principles of argument, right? So,
Mhm.
um,
I'm just saying, if you don't want to have a rude awakening, just steer clear of
right,
critical thinking, right? Just stay in your
right.
bubble.
That was the rude awakening for me, was realizing that a lot of my arguments didn't make sense. Um, if you trace them back to like the premises, you would notice that the premise just doesn't make sense. So the big one um, for the trans rights movement is this idea that gender identity exists. But if you go all the way back to this premise that gender identity exists, what's the evidence for it? And so that's sort of where my arguments are. All of my arguments in detransition advocacy are now, is there's no evidence for this.
Mm.
So why are we affirming something that there's no evidence for? I mean, there is evidence, quote unquote, but the evidence is all um, anecdotal things from trans-identified adults. It's this claim that they have twin studies where identical twins are more likely to transition than fraternal twins, apparently.
Hmm.
Um,
That's got to
but
be a marginalized group within the marginalized group. I've never
it's
met a
it's
trans twin
interesting.
before.
I have actually,
Okay.
and both of them transitioned, so it was
Okay.
weirdly accurate to me. But like at the same time, this isn't proof that they have gender identity that's different than their body. It's proof that maybe people can be predisposed to having dysphoria. Does not necessarily mean that they're literally, a male in a female body or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's when the writing changed, and I became very, it sort of like I would say logical. The reason I'm hesitating is that I think that I'm being logical, but like I'm sure there are people that are going to tell me that I'm not being logical on certain things. And, one of the arguments that I had with a friend after detransitioning, he told me that I'd been radicalized. Even though I think that I was seeing things more logically, he thought that I was being radicalized. And I guess it's different depending on what you personally believe. But
yeah,
yeah, in those years, the autistic activism community was very, very, they're like a microcosm of social justice, and they're probably, I'm going to say it's probably the worst. It was worse than trans activism. They're very, very, everybody is very emotionally reactive. Everyone's very angry. Everybody's very touchy. And, they all have developmental disabilities, so it makes sense. But I, I think a lot of people who have autism and have ADHD, et cetera, also grow up to have personality disorders if they have a lot of trauma in their lives, or if they have a lot of
well,
instability.
It could be the case that for whatever reason, activism is uniquely adept at socially processing trauma, anxiety, and it invites the expression of things that mask trauma or mask crises and allows the expression of them, and it justifies the expression of frustration with the world. And yet it can be the case, if that is true, that it doesn't actually provide redemption or healing. It just provides the explosion or the agitation to express, but it doesn't, like we see with woke dogma or social justice ideology, you have the original sin, you don't have the redemption. Within activism, you have the first part of therapy, which is getting it all out, but you don't have resolution. It's not built into it to have a resolution because you have to change the world and save the world. So there's not that. It invites the personal going into the universal, but it doesn't complete the circuit by... I see that a lot. And within autism communities, autism activism, whenever I brushed across it, I've seen like, whoa, this is like social justice on steroid, the policing of language, the interpersonal dynamics, and even you'll run afoul of them by saying a phrase wrong, and then they'll say, no, this is how you're supposed to say it. It's a person with autism. And then they'll autistically start arguing with each other about these words when you're like, you guys aren't actually making a point now. You're just expressing things. And so it's really difficult to help those people to make informed communications and rhetoric, and also ground themselves in that, especially in the disembodied realm of the internet. And internet activism turns that even up the more, because it's not really grounded. It's more about clanging the pots than washing the dishes. So it's really interesting. I just wanted to say all that because I'm thinking a lot about activism. That's my main work. And then also with autism and its intersection with gender ideology. So having you, or speaking with you, you've gone through that. You've been involved in that. Now, I really appreciate that you said now you are engaged in Detrans advocacy. It's a very small little linguistic change, but advocacy rather than activism, it reorients the work that you're trying to accomplish, as in you're raising awareness, you're trying to provide people help rather than change the system and get involved in, changing the structural system, which is where a lot of activism runs afoul. I'm sorry to ramble. I just had a
No, it's
lot.
okay.
I'm just excited to be able to speak with you about this because I've been thinking about it for a while.
No, and it's good, and you make the point that I came to is that sort of same thing in activism, and even in autistic activism. The whole their end goal is revolution. Basically, they need a revolution, and if the revolution doesn't happen, then they're still oppressed, sort of thing. And I found being in autistic advocacy, they are probably the people who are the least likely to work with people and make compromise. Autistic people will not make a compromise with you. So, for example, there was it was a feature film of some kind that was being shown somewhere in Toronto or in Ontario, the province where I live, and it was a good film. I had seen the film. I thought it was a good example of you know good representation of what living with autism looks like, as particularly for like non-speaking autistic people who don't get a lot of representation. And that film was being the showing of the film was being sponsored by two different groups. One of them was an autism like self advocacy is what they call it. Is like, so it's autistic people themselves rather than parents of autistic people. One of them was a self advocacy group, and the other one was, I think, parent and professional run, so run by autism professionals and parents. And the self advocacy group dropped out, basically. So even though this movie was a really good movie that they agreed with, they wouldn't stand next to a group that didn't agree with everything that they agreed with, basically. And I think that it was one of the reasons I left, is because I kept sort of begging people, we need to like compromise with these people. We need to sort of work with them. We need to stop treating them like they're horribly awful people, like
heretics, apostates.
They'll call anyone who's doing behavioral therapy a child abuser, and you can't speak to people that way and then expect them to listen to you. So
what's behavioral therapy, and why is that problematic?
So the main therapy for autistic children, especially if they're non-speaking, is they have a certain type of therapy called behavioral therapy, applied behavioral analysis. And in some places, they're doing this therapy 40 hours a week, which is full time for a 2-year-old. And there's way too much to say about it that I'm not going to get into all of it now. But a lot of it involves, not a lot of it, they are trying to change it, trying to make it more modern these days. But traditionally, it involved a lot of aversives to get them to stop doing things. It's very much what is it called? It's like
Skinner?
positive reinforcement. Yeah, it's very Skinner. It's positive reinforcement. It's like, if you do this right, you get an M&M. If you do this wrong, they're trying to move away from aversives. But it used to be,
you lose a privilege.
You lose a privilege. Back then, it was like you get spanked. Even far enough back, you would get, they would get spanked or be forced to say in a certain area. It was a lot of is a lot of control over the child, basically. So that's why they think it's abusive. It's a lot of controlling what they do. But I feel like there's ways to talk about it without going straight to child abuse. And I think that's sort of the same thing with transition. Although, we can all agree that, telling a child that they can be the opposite sex, I think that is child abuse. But I think we have to be careful about when we say those words.
Child abuse, mutilation. Yeah. Really loaded terms, yeah.
And particularly, like, if you think about Texas, for example, where they're saying that transitioning children is child abuse and, child protective services are going to get involved. these are people that are going by what their doctors told them. So it becomes confusing for everyone, I think.
Well, yeah,
So
the reform has to happen on multiple levels. But if you bring up Child Protective Services advocating for non affirmative care, you also have to bring up the fact that, at least in California, more liberal places, Child Protective Services will be called on parents who don't affirm, too. So involving the law in a matter of psychology and medical intervention is very dangerous. It's very complex, and it can be weaponized just depending on what the law or the people who are writing and interpreting the laws, their biases. So it should be a last resort kind of thing, I think. But that's a huge conversation, because I know that the Florida also has issued a statement a couple weeks ago that they're going to suspend gender affirming care for teens, which is different than that's the medical. That's not necessarily like the enforcement getting involved, so far as I know, which is a different issue.
yeah. So I mean, that's the part I'm concerned about as well, is sort of how are we going to enforce things. But when you think about enforcement, even just sort of when you think about vaccines, for example, um, when you make something mandatory and someone doesn't understand why it's mandatory, I think it opens up the stage for a lot of like trauma, basically.
Hmm.
So if you tell if you've been telling a child for so long that they can transition and then you suddenly tell them they can't, I can understand why they would suddenly become extremely upset to the point of like suicidal ideation, for example. And um, I'm trying to make a parallel between sort of forcing people to take certain uh, medical, to go a certain direction with their medical
Hmm.
care. And I feel like there's sort of what's the
A
word?
way to understand through metaphor, to kind of understand.
Yeah,
Let's slow down. Let's think things through. This isn't a fight. We're just trying to figure out the best way to safeguard and facilitate good lives for everyone.
yeah. So instead of enforcing things, instead of we need to talk about it. um, and that's just sort of, I think, where people need to go with activism in general. Is a lot of people are sort of jumping to what's the way that we can get this done the fastest, and I don't think getting it done the fastest is necessarily the right way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people are doing that by they're using the same sort of tactics that the trans rights activists use, emotional manipulation, by saying, oh, if they don't get transition as soon as possible, they're going to kill themselves, blah blah blah. And then the flip side is people on quote unquote my side will say, oh, you're teaching children gender identity in school, you're a groomer, blah blah blah. And I feel like that's sort of the same emotional manipulation to try and make something stop as soon as possible or get something that you want as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think it's the direction that we need to go in. We need to go in a direction where everybody understands. So
We're
I don't know if we're going to get there, but
well, a little bit at a time. Some people somewhere will start to understand a little bit more, and then you can just put one little feather in your cap, if that's the right phrase
yeah.
for that. So you just desisted from testosterone due to your skin, your epidermis. What was it like to go off of that? Did things feel better, feel worse, and was it just like, okay, well, I don't have to do that anymore?
It was probably mostly like, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. Um, I would say the main reason was probably the acne, but like the other parts were I've talked about before. But one of them was that I just couldn't force myself to keep doing the injection I had to do it every 2 weeks. So
Wow.
um, that 14th day would come, and I was supposed to do a shot of testosterone that day, and I would be like, I don't want to do it today. I'll just do it tomorrow. And then that would continue until I was taking my doses like every 3 weeks apart instead of every 2 weeks. and there was a part of me that thought, this is probably not a good idea to not take the drugs that I've been prescribed at the correct intervals. So maybe I should stop taking them. So that was another sort of, I guess, reason to come off. But when I came off of it, I don't know. I feel like I don't think there was much of a difference almost, except that my period came back. So
Did you
that was
suffer
it.
any, or did your female system react negatively or to testosterone, or did you suffer any consequences in that? It can be extreme. It can just nothing really changes. Everybody's kind of different.
Um, I don't think I felt anything personally. I do know that a lot of people dealt with like atrophy. Um, Maybe part of it was because I just wasn't very sexually active. Maybe I didn't notice anything. Um, but even like day to day, I didn't notice anything. I've since had a hysterectomy, unfortunately, so
Hmm.
it's just a non-functional system now. But yeah, no, I don't. I can't think of anything personally.
And then you also mentioned that your the way that you thought had to change. It wasn't just about desisting from the testosterone. You still identified as a trans male or as a man, and your thinking had to change over the course of time. So, in those, what you said, 4 or 5 years when you were not on testosterone, but you were trans-identified, what was your connection to the community, trans community, or to the identity, or how did you end up use that identity to plug in the world, and how did that end up changing over time?
Um, I would first say that when I detransit, not detransition, but when I went off of testosterone, I started identifying as non-binary instead
Okay.
of as male. But I still pass as male. I don't think I look like I'm looking at myself right now, and I don't think I look male. But like out in the world, as it turns out, most people think I'm male. Maybe it's the voice, um, or maybe it's because like I don't normally dress overly femininely or whatever. But that was still my experience in those years after I went off of testosterone. Is I just kept being sort of read as male, and I had shorter hair then too. So, um, but uh, in terms of sort of that identity, I guess part of it was part of it was useful to me when I was in like autistic self advocacy. So having the label of being trans, being like a trans autistic person, I think was useful to me in that space.
Did it give you an edge?
Yeah, I would say so. Like it was very much like an identitarian type of place where everyone is like, oh, well, I'm a person of color, and disabled, because everyone in autistic community is disabled and this and this and this, and so having sort of an extra,
Mm-hmm. Check.
especially
Yeah.
especially in this sort of that sort of community where it was very 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 identitarian, where the more the more labels you have, the more likely it is that people are going to take you seriously, that sort of thing.
Or you have more cards to shut other people down because standpoint epistemology, kind of, you're always jockeying and divvying up authority based on this characteristic. It's just the money, the social status, money in a way.
Mhm. Yeah, so
Did
it was useful to me in that
I,
sense. Yeah.
did over time? I'm sorry to go here, but did are there, like, I just wonder if, like, there's, like, it's kind of like an economic system. I'm just thinking of the money metaphor, but it is kind of a money. It's a credit, and I wonder if there's inflation and deflation over time. These different identities shift in communities depending on the hot topic. It's like, okay, we're going to focus on this disability, or we're going to focus on racism right now because it's a hot topic in the world, and so that becomes inflated and it has more cred, and then it kind of lowers in importance over time. I just wonder if anybody's studying that.
It's a good question, because I'm sure it is. Like in my experience in activism, I would say that, you know, being trans has, for example, when I first transitioned to now, I think being trans is probably worth more than certain other. I won't name any because I don't know which ones that it's more important than, but it seems to be it's treated as the singular most marginalized and the most um,
Oppressed and yeah,
yeah, basically the
and
most
yeah,
oppressed. So
yeah.
so it was useful during those periods of time, um, but I think maybe even the detransition almost came about because I realized that it didn't matter how many identities I had, that people were still going to not listen to me if they could find a way to not listen to me. um, um,
Hmm. So
yeah, I don't know, I can't think of anything.
that critical thinking really disrupted you and sent you that one class kind of sent you on a skeptical quest to really examine assumptions and also start to examine yourself then.
Yeah, and one of the things was that like I started forming an interest in like uh it was it's an intervention that helps autistic people learn how to write to communicate. So like pointing to letters on like a letterboard sort of thing. And there's not a lot of evidence for that, but it does seem like it's helping a lot of people. So I sort of like went into like a deep dive and looking at evidence. And I think this is one of the reasons that I started looking at critical thinking, is because I wanted to make arguments for this particular intervention that made sense, sort of thing. Like I wanted to know what counts as credible evidence, what counts as peer reviewed is better than not peer reviewed, and a systematic review is better than a single study. So like I looked into that. I went in, I had a research methods class in like addition to the critical thinking. So all of these things sort of came together. And I think sort of the interest in that is really what sort of brought up um, starting to have critical thinking. And when I started thinking in that way, I also realized that the community that I was part of didn't support critical thinking. It only supported thinking in a specific way. It supported an ideology. Um, and I think that's sort of just what sent me on that path, because from there I started following people that were criticizing cancel culture. So not specifically within like the autistic community where I had all these examples of cancel culture happening, but like just sort of greater culture, especially like leftists. I was listening to leftists talk about cancel culture because it just seemed like there weren't very many leftists talking about cancel culture and how to deal with it. Sorry about my cat. Um,
Does your cat need a biscuit?
no, she just wants to come up
Oh, okay.
and put her tail all over the
Oh, wow. Oh,
camera.
wow. Oh,
My apologies.
it's all good.
But where was I? Anyway, so
You started to look outside of your community at this cancel culture phenomena, and I'm intimating that you come across some problematic thinkers.
the people that I like started listening to, yeah, they were canceled themselves. So, these are people that were canceled themselves. And I tried to introduce those people to people within like for example within autism advocacy that I thought would be open to this and be like, hey, this is happening to you, you're being canceled, how are we going to fix this, here's an idea of how to fix this, let's um instead of defending ourselves against them all the time, then why don't we just ignore them when they're making arguments that aren't supported by any evidence? Or let's not treat the people that we disagree with in this way. That's sort of the thing that I've seen the most in activism, is that we'll talk about how mean it is or how problematic it is that certain people are treating us in a certain way, suppressing our ability to speak and so on. And then we do that to everyone else in the same group as us. So, um, yeah, so they were problematic people that I was apparently following, but they were describing something that I was experiencing, and that really did help me come out of it. And the other thing that helped me sort of come out of thinking in a rigid way like that was I lived with someone who detransitioned 6 months before me. So this was a friend of mine. We lived together for 3 or 4 years. Um, and 6 months before me, he decided to detransition. And the whole time, he had never been really into social justice. So he came to it from like a different direction than I did. And so we had a lot of discussions where we weren't really agreeing with each other. And I think all of those discussions and arguments, and not all of them ended well, but um, it helped me learn how to sort of control myself around someone that doesn't agree with me on absolutely everything. And when he detransitioned, he did try and have discussions with me about like Abigail Schreier's irreversible damage, for example. He would talk about that, and I wouldn't want to get into it basically. So, or he tried to show me the Detrans subreddit, and I refused to read anything there. So you can tell where my mind was at those periods of time where I wouldn't even look at information that would have challenged me. Um, so I think being around someone that I trusted and that I, gained um, respect for over a whole period of time really helped me to be able to open up in that way. Um, it's unfortunate. I just feel like anyone else who knows me, people who used to be my friends, would have just said that this guy radicalized me, basically. So, which I think is sad because I don't think he radicalized me. I think that he helped me sort of see what was true versus what was ideological, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And
What
yeah,
was
no.
what was kind of the first steps towards detransitioning then, ideologically?
Um, I would say the first step, anything that for me that went sort of towards detransition is I was still in autism advocacy. I'm going to say this was like June 2020. J.K. Rowling posted something about how autistic girls were more likely to transition and that she was concerned about autistic girls. And so at this point in time, I was still very, very much involved in autism self advocacy. And on Twitter, everyone around me was making this hashtag that was something like autistic not confused, or we're not confused, or something like that. And somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a part of me thinking, I don't think I would have transitioned if I had been diagnosed with autism earlier. So maybe I was confused. And I don't agree with this hashtag. I think actually maybe J.K. Rowling has like a little bit of truth to her there. And I think that is when it started. I think that was the first, because I posted something on Facebook. So I have the record there, knowing that in that point in time, I said out loud, I wouldn't have transitioned if I had been diagnosed sooner. And I think that's sort of what headed me on that path. And that was probably a couple months after my friends started detransitioning. So it was clearly on my mind, even though I wasn't like actively looking up um, other people's opinions and sort of other ideas that I had been afraid to look up before. But the day that I transitioned, I looked at everything. So like I had one night where I told my friend, even if I did detransition, would women even still want me to be in their spaces with them? Blah blah blah. And that was the night that I was basically like, yeah, I'm gonna try and I'm going to change all my ID back. I'm probably going to try and pass as a woman again. We'll see what happens. And that night I read everything. Like that week I read Irreversible Damage. That night I was on the Detrans subreddit reading things. I was looking for like just essays that other detransitioners had written. I read everything in like the first week. So it was sort of like making up for all that time where I had refused to um, listen to anything that my friend had said. And like looking back on that, that probably really sucked for my friend who was going through this and me refusing to like engage with him over and over on it.
You know,
So
it could have been very beneficial for him to have somebody resisting him, so that he would have to really think through that stuff. You don't know. It could have been You could have been giving him a gift without realizing it.
could be. I hope so. But yeah, I think that that was sort of where it started was having it happen in my house because we were living together. So watching him, he cut his hair, started, he stopped taking estrogen and started taking testosterone. So he was growing facial hair again for the first time in 8 years and stuff like that. So that was all happening in my house. So even though I wasn't reading anything about it, it was this idea that after 8 years, someone could make a mistake. So he was had transitioned for 8 years, and I had transitioned for 10. So it's hard. It's a lot harder to ignore when it's just happening right in front of you. So
Did you have an adverse reaction to that? Did you block him out, or take out frustration? Did he begin to erode your safety and your identity by watching his erode? Did that cause you some instability in your own self?
um, I don't know if it caused instability. Like it was definitely breaking down barriers. So like my those almost thought barriers, the cognitive dissonance was going away. I think that was happening, but otherwise, not really. Like I don't know. It's hard for me to think of it in that way, just because I've always felt really, really safe around this particular person.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
to feel like unsafe around him, I don't think that happened. It was more,
I could imagine that
yeah.
somebody would be kind of defensive being exposed to that.
If I had known him for less amount of time, maybe, or if I was closer to the beginning of my transition, I think it would have been more difficult.
Hmm.
But at this point, it was 10 years in, and yeah, I don't think that, not really in that sense.
And did detransition, returning to identifying just as a female, did that feel like a relief? Did it feel like a homecoming? Well, how did that feel like generally?
I think the word homecoming is interesting because I used the same term when I was writing recently, and I was thinking about how I wanted it to be a homecoming, but the body that I'm accepting now isn't the same one that it was when I started transitioning. So I'm not really coming home to something. I'm having to process what I have now in a new, different way, sort of thing. So like I don't get the opportunity to accept my breasts ever because I don't have them anymore. So I don't have the opportunity to get used to having a period because I don't have one anymore. And I don't have the opportunities to accept my body, which I feel like that's sort of what a homecoming might entail, just sort of like coming home to yourself and accepting your body. And what I would have done, what I wish I would have done instead of transitioning, basically. I'm never going to have the opportunity to do that. So in that sense, it wasn't really a homecoming, but in another sense, and I've heard this from multiple people now, multiple detransition people have told me that after detransitioning, it almost feels like someone you used to be has awakened, and you're like, it's almost like a dissociative identity or something, where part of you went away and a different version of you sort of took over during the period that you were transitioned. And when I detransitioned, it was almost like that person that I had tucked away came back. So, yeah.
Was that
I,
person ticked off or?
um, kind of. Maybe less ticked off and more like upset at this time, but you
How
know,
did you process that? If you had to deal with regret or despair at your own choices, how did you process that? How have you been processing that?
it's ongoing. It's
Yeah.
so it's been a year and a half, I think. And there are days, the first 6 months after the detransition were the hardest. So in the first 6 months, the thing that bothered me the most was the hysterectomy. So um I had the hysterectomy in 2018, 1 year after I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD and so on. Um, and the reason I had it done is because by that time, the provincial insurance in where I live is covering it. And I think that if they weren't covering it, I never would have gotten it because I never would have been able to pay for it. So it felt like a very impulsive choice on my part, especially if you looked at my history, you wouldn't find like I wasn't that person that grew up not wanting to have children. I was a person that grew up wanting to have children, that wanted to get pregnant and had like a list of all the names that I was going to name my children. And I don't know what happened in the years that I transitioned, but for whatever reason, I ended up pursuing the hysterectomy. So um, in the first 6 months after detransition, that was what I was processing was the fact that I'm now infertile. I still have ovaries. So like in in a world where I have thousands and thousands of dollars and then nothing unethical would happen, I could still have a child, but it's probably not going to happen. But in the first 6 months post detransition, every time I saw a child interacting with a parent, I started crying. I had days where I just sort of went and lay on my bed and cried for a long time. I called up my doctor and I told her, I want to see a fertility clinic. And that was the first time I told her I detransitioned, basically, was basically telling her that I want to get pregnant now. And, I had a surgery that makes me not be able to be pregnant ever. And I don't know, she didn't even take that as like she didn't I don't know. I don't think my doctors are ever going to sound sorry, but she didn't seem to feel bad about it or in any way. It was just sort of, oh, okay. You would have gotten pregnant if you didn't have a hysterectomy. Okay. And I don't know. They made it very neutral. Um but yeah, so the 6 months after that were really difficult. And like, I don't know, Christmas last year, my parents were like taking pictures of like my nieces and nephews, and I had to leave the room because I was crying because I was like, there's a part of me being like, I'll never give my nieces and nephews any cousins, or my parents will never see me have children, or anyway. So the being and I honestly, it's probably because I'm in my 30s, and that's the whole biological clock ticking thing. Um, I did all the research and found out that like every year after the age of like 34, 35, you have less and less. There's less and less likely that you could have children. So I think that's why it all came up now. It's all coming up, and that I think that's why it's the big thing for me is because I'm in my 30s. But so that was the thing that was the most difficult to process was the infertility. I think with other things, like for example, my breasts, I had the mastectomy 10 years ago, so it's almost like I've sort of been able to deal with it at this point. Yeah. You okay?
Yes. You hit me pretty hard.
I know, and I know I sit here talking about it and I'm not getting emotional, but it is emotional behind the scenes. I know I get emotional behind the scenes. For whatever reason, when I'm talking to people, I can just be like, "Yep, ha ha ha." So it doesn't get
You're a
difficult.
trained advocate at this point. You know how to work the room.
Yeah,
So the scene, the Detrans scene. There's a lot of developments. I'm just now realizing, and this is not about me. It's just I'm just now realizing the pattern of my Detrans interviews is that there's so many people that have been detransitioning in the last 2 years, and I'm just kind of doing the math. I'm like, this is going to be a big community. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of personalities. There's a lot of comorbidities. And it's a landscape that's ripe or in need of infrastructure for support and barriers and kind of codes of conduct so that different types of people that are going through detransition don't trigger each other, for lack of a better word, or exacerbate unhealthy behaviors or end up harming each other or not really being helpful to each other. So I'm beginning to be concerned on how we can strategize, and it's not,
you know,
I'm not responsible for it, but I'm keen to that, and I'm seeing just a need, and I'm wondering what you're seeing and where you think, because I think you sound like somebody who would be an expert on organizing the infrastructure for something like this with just your life experience and stuff like that. So I think that you probably have a lot to offer by way of suggestion or by just sensing where the field's at and where it needs to go, or what where people should be paying attention, putting their attention, where they should not be putting their attention.
yeah. I wish I knew more. First of all, to be like more effective in terms of organizing, but because right now, personally, I'm feeling very um, what's the word? There's a lot of different detrans groups, but it feels like not all of us are in the same group. So like detrans voices and post-trans are both mainly female detransitioners. I think post-trans is specifically female detransitioners.
Is that
Detrans
a
voices,
subreddit?
no, they're both they're like nonprofit groups almost.
Okay.
um I don't know if they're technically nonprofit groups, but they're groups. They have websites, they put out some material. um so like one part of it is the lack of involvement of male detransitioners, and that's not necessarily their fault. um even like my friend that detransitioned does not want any involvement in anything public facing, basically. um so he's not gonna say anything. um um
But and if this is improper, you don't have to say it. But we're speaking about him anonymously. I'm just wondering, does he just if he's a case study, what would he need if not to be public? Like still available groups or talking therapy, or is he just kind of going his own way at this point? Because I'm sure that there's plenty of men specifically who'll be fine doing that, or still
yeah,
needs some sort of resource.
yes, and like I don't know if he's actually gotten into. I know there's a Detrans men's Discord that they recently put together. I don't know if he's in that yet. I did tell him about it, and he said, "Yeah, that is the only thing I'm still interested in. Is like,
Okay, just a support group kind of
yeah,
thing.
being
Yeah,
with other people that have gone through the same thing, but otherwise he doesn't want to talk about it."
yeah.
Um, but yeah, and I think part of the reason, and there's like a lot of reasons that men probably aren't involved, but I think one of the reasons is I think it's a little easier for them to sort of integrate back in if they haven't had, specifically if they haven't had genital surgery. But and it's because testosterone is such a strong drug, is that people who were trans women that detransition, I think they have less of a hard time passing. Not necessarily, but less of a hard time. They start to pass as men pretty quickly. And the opposite isn't really true. And I think the same thing is true for transition in general. If you grew up on testosterone, or if you had testosterone in your system for a long period of time, you're always going to seem more masculine. Mm-hmm. So I think when trans women come out of it, a lot of us have the voice, and that's never going away. I did hear that there's surgeries for it, but I don't want to push surgeries for detransition people. Like mm-hmm. we don't want like more people telling you that surgery is the way to go. Mm-hmm. My friend that I mentioned is getting surgery to have his breast removed, but I don't think I'm going to ever do reconstruction, for example. But yeah, in terms of like where to go with detransitioner, it's very obvious that the group of people who are detransitioning and like the people who are online is a very, very there's just so many people coming from so many different angles now, which I think is a good thing. So that's a good direction for us to go. And I got the impression that several years ago it was very, very mostly women and mostly radical feminists. That's what it sounded to me, is that there was a very, very strong radical feminist detransitioner group. And it seems like we sort of
diluted that
influence. Yeah. They're still there, but I think it's important to have just all of those different perspectives. So I think we're going in a good direction in that sense.
Do you have a ideological home at this point?
I would say I'm probably politically homeless at this point.
Yeah.
A lot of it, I feel like I would have called myself a feminist if it weren't for the fact that I was around radical feminists all the time on Twitter. So like I would call myself a feminist in that I know that there was historical oppression against women, and I can trace that back, and I acknowledge that, and I think that it still has an effect on how people are treated today. But also, I don't think that me saying that I don't think that we should be able to abuse men for having been part of that. A lot of people would just get like, I feel like people would say that I'm not a feminist if I police women's language, for example, towards their oppressors. And I will do that. I will police your language. I will say, I will say that I don't care if you think you're an oppressor or an oppressed person. You don't get to be mean to other people. That's really sort of the baseline. So
yeah, it's really if you hold by the principles of critical thinking and civility, that kind of makes it problematic to be in too many activist groups, because those two things interrupt the will to power. Those two things interrupt and slow down the process of achievement and goal, which are good things, because then you actually know if what you want is what you actually want. And then also compromising and working together with other people, making friends.
Yeah.
It's a good, healthy thing.
It's sort of the frustrating part of activism, is that I start making friends with people, and then sometimes I don't like how they go about their activism. So I feel like I still like them as people, but I can't follow them on Twitter, or I can't be involved in their activism just because it just rubs me the wrong way. But like, mm-hmm. I don't know, that's always been sort of a difficult thing in activism for me, is sort of like finding people that um, do rub you the right way. But like at the same time, I don't know, because I want to have people who have all different opinions. I want to have friends that all have different opinions, but I also don't want them to be mean people. I don't know. It's sort of difficult to try and find that, especially when a lot of them are trying to justify why they're allowed to be mean. So that part is difficult to sort of
Yeah.
square.
Yeah, accepting people as they are is a human achievement, an achievement of humanity, actually. It doesn't come easy. Especially to actually hold a moral code and then allow people to, obey a different one, or go about things in a different ways.
Yeah. So basically, like for me, I've just sort of I think there's like a certain threshold of amount of I allow you. You can be this mean, and I'll be like, okay, But then if you sort of hit the threshold and then you're too mean for too long, then I'm just like,
No.
maybe not. The other part is, if you're mean to people that you don't agree with, this is something you learn as part of like deconstructing cancel culture. If you're around people that are really, really mean to the people that you don't agree with all the time, you have to remember there's always something in the back of your head going, that could be you. As soon as you disagree with this person, then they'll turn on you and treat you the exact same way. So I think that's part of it also, is to be cautious. You don't want to be treated that same way.
So you got a book in fits and starts, and you have a
Hopefully.
mountain of writing archived. Thankfully, you should probably make a hard copy of that at some point. It sounds like you have the makings of a lot of work ahead of you. Where are your avenues right now? Where are you at right now? I see you on Twitter. And are there other groups that you're involved in or that you advocate for and name at this point?
Um, I do have my blog, Some Nuance, Please.
Some nuance, please.
Yeah, that's my my Substack.
Okay.
Um, it's funny because I've heard people say they want nuance, but they actually don't want nuance. But I do want nuance, so it's hard to sort of convince people I want the right kind of nuance. But
Yeah, yeah.
I think that name, even some nuance, please, was really just, it wasn't even just towards everyone else. It was also towards myself.
Mm-hmm.
So reminding of myself. But yeah, so I have the Substack. That's what it is. It's on Substack. Um, and I have Twitter. Um, I would say that I'm probably consider myself a member of Gender Dysphoria Alliance. So I agree with what they're trying to accomplish, and will probably be involved in some of their things coming forward. Um, there's not really anything else. I closed my DMs recently because I wanted to take a break. It was a good break time.
Yeah.
Uh, I chose to do this interview just for like, for myself, basically. It's sort of like a personal goal. Get interviewed by Benjamin Boyce. So
I'm so honored.
this is a true thing, and I think I've told people this. Okay, so after the Detrans Awareness Day webinar, I was with several other people. I think it was 3 or 4 of them had already been interviewed by you, and then me and Robin were in there, and Robin was about to get his interview also. You messaged him that day, and we were all just talking about it, and I was just like, so exciting, get to be on Benjamin Boyce.
Oh no, I'm a rite of passage.
But no, when I told them in this, that I told them sometime last year, I opened my DMs because you followed me, and I wasn't following you back at that time. I am now, but at that time, I was like, I opened them specifically because I was hoping you would ask me. So, yeah.
You're gonna make me tear up sick time.
It was not, I'm not trying to be, in a tearing way. It was
Sadistic.
sort of a, you got all of the people that I personally admire, and I personally admire you for going into that, and going into this topic. So Yeah.
Okay, I need to get it off of me. I need to get the eyes off me.
Okay.
I commend you for speaking out and also just being aware, taking breaks, and setting limits to yourself. I feel I have a sense that you have a lot to contribute in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have to be as an advocate or an activist. So
Hopefully, hopefully the book finishes. That's what my plan is. The plan is finish the book. Um, in my mind, there's only a finite amount of things to say about detransition. Um, for me, I mean, because there could be, for me, there's, talking about how bullying came into it and talking about how being a woman came into it and talking about how being autistic came into it. So I have all those things. And then maybe a different detransitioner could talk about how having OCD came into it, or talking about how being a male came into it, or talking about how, how they processed feminism on Tumblr, stuff like that. So there's a lot of things to talk about, but there's only so much that I can talk about specifically. And I feel like if I finish the book, it'll be sort of like my magnum opus in some way, and then maybe I can move on to something else. I don't know what I'm going to move on to, but
do you have any ideas?
in my head, I would love to get away from any type of advocacy and activism.
What's that one Canadian game where they rub the ice while something slides on it?
Curling?
Yeah.
I could go into
Is that an
curling.
option?
I haven't seen curling around here. I have seen cornhole around here.
Cornholes.
Apparently, apparently, there's just like a big cornhole league in this area, which I didn't know about. And I have thought about it. There's a part of me going, I could get good at cornhole, maybe. So yeah, I want to get into something that's not advocacy, just hobby outside,
Yeah.
even just writing fiction novels or something, anything. But I wouldn't have guessed this of me 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I would have been like, I'm going to be in activism forever, trying to change the world forever. And now I'm like, in 5 years, if everything went well for me, I would like to have a family and not be thinking about activism ever again. So we'll see what happens, I guess.
Yeah, there should be some sort of retirement plan for activists, for them and for the world. It's like, okay, you did your tour, you did your 2 tours. Now go open a brewery and get out of our hair.
I feel like it's similar. I feel similar in that, like, I feel like I did my debt to the world, even though I don't think it was necessarily I don't think it was necessarily all good. Especially the whole time that I was, advocating for transition and stuff like that. Now I'm looking back on that being like, oh, that was actually a bad thing I did in the world. But, I spent 10 years trying to make the world better in my early 20s and late 20s, and now I'm in my early 30s, and time to retire. I don't have the strength for it anymore. And there are always new 20-year-olds that are going to pop up and take over. So
Eternal September.
And, the same thing for detransition, I think. There's going to be more detransitioners that pop up. And when they pop up, then it's their time and it's my time to go and retire. So, yeah.
Well, Michelle, we should end the recorded section of our time together. Thank you for sharing and exposing yourself and what you've seen. And I will link to your products in the description, but not to the extent where people can look at your ancient live journal wolf LARPing stuff. Maybe they'll find you that somehow, but maybe they could stay hidden.
I almost want to post some of it now, because I'm 100% sure that there's something. I've got like text like little notepad files basically where I've like copied and pasted old things that I've written into, and I'm sure there's something. And right after we finish this, I'm going to track it down. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I do recommend you get into literature. I have a sense that you are a natural born writer, and going in the direction of even a young adult novel might just open you up to something fabulous.
I hope I go in that direction. Yeah. Thank you.
You mind saying goodbye to everyone at home?
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone at home.